Thank you, Alexandra, that you organize all this technical aspect, despite the fact that we have some small problem at the beginning to fit everything together. So I'm very pleased to come to New York and to been here many times, but for this occasion, first time at NYU, and to meet a scholar and the audience here and online. So thank you everybody who came to listen to a quite tragical case, which is about the Gulag. So there have been, as you know, numerous works since the fall of the Soviet Union, but even before, about the Gulag, but very little about film. So I tried to connect film and Gulag. And what was my interest for that? At the beginning, when I started this research, it was already 10 years ago, and I did a lot of other research on other topics than the Gulag, hopefully, because you can not work with live with a nightmare all the time. And I was lucky because I had the chance to go to the Solovki mostly 12 years ago. So I visited the Solovki, which was during a trip that I was invited in Petersburg for a film festival in the jury. So I asked them if I could have the permission to go to Solovki because I needed, as a foreigner, a special authorization, and they gave it to me. So I went there, and it was a quite complicated trip because you have to go from Paris to Petersburg to switch another flight, 4 more hour flight to Arkhangelsk, and then the next day I got a flight to the Solovki on a terrible Soviet aircraft of the 30s. So I saw it was maybe my last trip in my life, and we landed on the earth, on the ground, and there was a kind of small airport there. But there are other ways to get there, which are more maybe comfortable, is to get by train and by ferry. And in the 20s, people get there in this manner, which was terrible because they never returned back. And so I explored during 3 days the Solovki, and by chance, a few years before, I was at UCLA in Los Angeles, and I met Marina Goldovskaya, who did the movie the Solovki Power. So I wanted to show you some extract. And when we met, then I knew that I was planning to go to the Solovki later. I watched her movie before going, so I knew precisely where I should go and what should I do. And at that time, I had no idea to make a special research on the Solovki. So I went there, I visited the place, and there were, of course, my idea was to find some traces of the Gulag. And there were mainly no traces, nothing, just some graves and one sculpture, that's it. And later I met a woman who was an architect from Moscow and settled there, and she opened a small museum. So by chance I was able to visit this museum the last day before my departure. So that was also a great visit because the museum is even not very well known. So most of the people who go to the Solovki are pilgrims. Even Putin was there just for religious purpose because you have still the big monastery. And then on my way back to Petersburg, I went to Memorial. I knew them. I met them, and they gave me the original movie, which was shot in 1927. So when I came back to France, I started to explore this movie, to go through archives. And I did before another work on Theresienstadt in Germany, a film made by the Nazis, which is very well known, which was made in 1944. And which is about how you're happy to live in a ghetto. So it's about also the same kind of movie. And I was impressed when I watched both of the movies that are very similar. The way the cameraman shoots the scene of daily life, happy daily life in a camp, something like that, working, playing, joking, etc. So, which is not the reality, but both are interesting film. I won't present here the film Theresienstadt, which is called the city given to the Jews by the Führer. There is only 20 minutes left, and the film was restored, and you can also watch it in Israel. He's in Yad Vashem. I went there also. So one of my friends in Tel Aviv restored it at that time. But they found it in the 60s. But the film about the Solovki was quite unknown. And I tried to find some evidence. And so I went first, I did some research in Berlin, trying to figure out if maybe the German had copies, the Soviets, 15 years later to make their own film. But I went to different libraries. I didn't find any evidence about that. But then I went to Moscow, and as a geek and as a regularly, I found some articles about the Solovki. So today I will present this movie, Slom, which means Sovietsky Lager Особенное назначение, Soviet camp with a specific appellation. And I will try to go through some pictures of the movie. Oh, this is a picture I took when you arrived there. It's the landscape. It's tremendous, beautiful. It's an archipelagos. The reason why Solzhenitsyn later on, he was never at the Solovki, but later on when he wrote his archipelago, he took this idea, I think, from this first labor camp. So it's about 165 kilometers from the North Pole with a terrible weather, very cold in the winter. The winter lasts more than 8 months, 6-7 months. And the summer is also terrible, very hot. So when you read some report of the Solovki camp is quite well documented. When I came back to France, I found a lot of articles and works about the Solovki. So most of them describe the terrible condition and the climate there. So a lot of people died because of the climate. So as I said, many books have been published, and the most famous authors are Shalamov and Solzhenitsyn, who describe the reality of the Soviet labor camp, and also numerous of historian attempts to work since the opening of the archives in the mid-90s. But paradoxically, very few films have examined the history and the visual reality, as also where are the concrete traces of the camp. And the film can also give evidence about this concrete reality. So most of these traces have been erased. The Solovki labor camp was opened in 1923, 1924, and was closed in 1938, just before World War II. It doesn't mean that the system disappeared, because it was developed in other part of Soviet Union on another scale. And it's interesting to study the Solovki because it's we call it a dispositif, a device, first device, which express the whole project of developing later the whole network of different camps, which works with different aspects also at that time. So 1988, I should say, Marina Goldovskaya, whom I quoted, mentioned, was a documentary filmmaker. She died last year, but her film, Solovki, The Power of the Solovki, sparked a widespread debate about the origin of the Gulag at that time for a documentary during the perestroika. And that was also a time when I came back after to Soviet Union, because for a long time I didn't go back there. I'm French, but I was there for my studies in Leningrad during 1 year in the mid-70s, and then I came back much more later at the end of the 80s for a book purpose. And this movie got at that time 15 million of viewers, which is very impressive for a documentary. And it's also interesting because at the end of the Soviet Union, as you know, there was a lot of possibility to express and to develop the first works on the Gulag. And this is a paradox of the Soviet and post-Soviet society, which is torn between impossible remembrance and imaginary. And what happened today with Memorial is a good, maybe, example. I will come back to that later on. So, as I said, Gulag is not a place, but it's a kind of administrative board. Well, that's very good. Short history of the Gulag in the 20s, when about the conception that the Soviet institution tried to develop at that time, because as I mentioned, Theresienstadt in Czechoslovakia, Theresienstadt was also a former prison in the 19th century, and the Solovki was an ancient Tsarist prison for criminal before October Revolution. So, how to film that kind of place, which, as you see, also took different name and appellation. How to find a track from the Solovki in the 1920 to the Kolyma in the late 30s, 40s, 60s. Is Gulag only an abstraction or a verbal abstraction, which then became a mental abstraction? Have a film here, is this film gives concrete visual traces about what is said and unsaid. So that also struck me when the first time I saw it, because it's also give a good perspective about how written culture was always oppressed in Soviet Union, but visual culture get more and less a kind of freedom. So it's so interesting to see that even when Shalamov was banned and his work was published much more later, Solzhenitsyn had a few novels which were published in the 60s before the Archipelago Gulag. But what struck me is that the film was able to be done and to be shown, and the film expressed really perfectly how you become enemy of class enemy of the people, how you are arrested, and how are the different steps to get from the Lubyanka to the Solovki, and how then you spend your time in the Solovki. So it's quite amazing to see in 1927 a real open expression about that. So the filmmaker, his name is Cherkasov, so I tried to find also some evidence about him in Soviet Cinema Encyclopedia. I remember also I called William Kleiman, who is a specialist of Eisenstein in Moscow, to ask him, did he know about that? So that's also funny, because Cherkasov is the name of the famous actor who played in Ivan Grozny. And Sloan became also later a very famous movement for the French radical filmmaker like Chris Marker in '68, who used this appellation Sloan, not from this movie, but from the idea of an elephant, you know. So there is some kind of strange association to Sloan, to Cherkasov, and to this anonymous filmmaker, who we suppose was a GPU member and was committed to make this movie at that time. So, so as a montage of different scenes, and the Solovki is of course a fake movie. It's a fake, and at the same time, the scenes are real. So here is some aspect of the of the localization where you are there. One picture that I took on the bottom, the color one, and the gray, black and white seems to say that very little has changed in 100 years. It's remained the same, more or less the same landscape. So Lenin, by a decree in November 1923, organized a Solovki, and I quoted also Trotsky because it's interesting. Often people were saying, of course, Trotsky could appear that as a better leader than Stalin because he was planning. He was more intellectual, it was blah, blah, blah. But when you read what he wrote at that time in 1923, and he helped to settle the Solovki, we use always to say Stalin is responsible of the Gulag, but the first who settled the Gulag were Lenin and Trotsky, the main Bolshevik at that time. Trotsky had organized the Red Army and crushed the first opponent, later in Kronstadt, the anarchist. And Solovki, so is a concept which turned into a brutal reality at the real beginning, 1923. But also, it's not because it's the first camp, but it's also just during and to the end of the Red Terror, because the Red Terror, which started in 1918, transformed also completely all these places. In 1919, 1920, the Solovki became the first Sovkhoz. The monks who were there were about 100 monks since the 16th century, were all arrested, and some of them already killed in the 1920s, before the Solovki turned into the first Gulag. So this period of war communism is also interesting to study in civil war because it kills more than 8 million people, 2 million left in immigration and left Russia. And step by step, the Solovki is transformed as a labor camp, became a kind of dystopia because also the monastery which I show you burned in 1923 partly, and you had this idea to put all these people in places. Already prison in Leningrad, Petrograd, and Moscow were full of people, and you had to displace people and to find an open place far away from central Moscow or Leningrad, far from these places, where you could displace people and re-educate them. So the Gulag forecast, I should say, this network of the whole Soviet system penal, which was described later on by Solzhenitsyn. So this is a political concept, context of the film, but for you it's not very new because you are specialists, most of you, of Russian and Soviet history and in Eastern Europe. So you more or less just to recall what was the political context of the film Sloan. So the film starts. The opening of the movie, if I am able to show you some extract later after the talk, show you the whole context of industrialization of the late 20s in Russia and the idea that there are already foreign enemies. It started already before 1937, foreign enemies who want to destroy our country and our socialism and our industry. So we have to fight against them. So the first trial here, the first famous trial, which took part in May, July 1928 about sabotage. And then there were some trials which were also filmed by the NKVD. We have also a very interesting film which was made by Sergei Loznitsa 3 years ago on the trial about the French who tried the French spy inside Soviet Union, who tried to destroy the industry, and the trial of the Russian engineers who claim that they are innocent in front of the judge. So that took place in the 32 years after the movie. Yeah. I was also interested by the Solovki because I'm little related to some Russian roots because of my grandmother and my grandfather, and I had a grand aunt who I never met, who was sent in 1934 with her husband to the Solovki after the killing of the death of Kirov. There was a big trials and big arrestation of people who were deported, mostly intellectuals from Leningrad, who were sent. So she spent most of her life, 15 years, 20 years, in different labor camps in Central Asia after the Solovki, after the Kiev, and she could not come back also to Leningrad. Then I have also, in my family, I'm related to Svetlana Boym, her grandmother, who was a sister of my grandfather, also was sent for many years after the war and I met her, I remember when she arrived in America in 1988. So she was sent also for many years after the war in different camp in Karelia, not the Solovki, but other camp. So you can just notice that there were four different steps in this process. 1923, 1929, Soviet state is constructing a labor camp in connection with the construction of a strategic zone called Grand North, which became very important in the 30s to explore all the resource of the Arctic region. So there was, of course, some industrial interest in using labor forces for that. So the film took place at the turn of 1927, 1928, but I doubt, and I think that the film was made maybe 1 or 2 years before, was shot 2 years before, because there was terrible epidemic dysentery in this year, 1927, 1928. So I suppose it was shot before. And already there were a few rumors about deportation. So I was also asking myself, why did they do this movie also? Why should you do a movie at that time? And there was already a French lawyer in France who was trying to defend some former prisoner who had escaped from the Solovki to Riga. There was some already report in some Latvian journal by former prisoner who miraculously could escape from these places, and they testified about the place. So at that time also in 1926, 1927, when Stalin started to take the power, there was this idea also to do some trade with a Western country, with Europe, to sell some wood and to get some financing from Europe to finance the Soviet industry. So they were afraid that Europe would start to boycott because of these rumors of deportation. So, and at that time, also a Communist Party were quite strong in Europe defending the Soviet Union. So there was a whole ideological fight, and at the same time, this task that we have to go on with the Stalinist industrial project, and we need some support from Europe. So we have to make a film to show that there is no camp. There is only a relocation of people who didn't agree with us. But I was also interested to know, and that took a lot of time later, where this movie was screened, who could see it, because I find some evidence that the film was screened near Paris by a communist trade union in the 1929, 1930s. There were some comments about this movie, but very little shown abroad, mainly shown inside Soviet Union. And in 31, this film, among other, was shown, but for a short time. And even you had a quite interesting comment by the audience at that time, who saw that and just inquire why the life in such a camp is better than in our daily life in Moscow, from simple workers, simple peasants. We just quoted that. So 1930, 1937 was the extension of the Solovki model to the rest of Soviet Union in the frame of the Soviet industrial policy, with the construction of the Belomor Canal, which was a big project, grandiose work on Stalin's scale. And in 1932, different other camps had settled around this north area to explore the different possibilities. 1937, third step. 39, the Great Terror, mass imprisonment. 1.5 million people were shot, and step by step, the Solovki was closed progressively to displace the inmates to other camps in more eastern zone, to Siberia, and later to use them, to free them, and to use them in the war against the Nazis in the late 40s during World War II. So in 1939, there was still 55 camps in the Great North with different denomination in a mostly closed city with secure zone, and so that was then the kind of concept which worked quite well. I did another work which I will not just expose here, but I did that last spring. I was in Japan for 2 months, and I was working about a Japanese prisoner who was sent to a labor camp in Siberia after 1945, when Stalin took them in Manchuria and sent them to different parts of industrial cities as a prisoner of war. And there were about already 600,000 soldiers, which it's a big amount of Japanese. So you had Japanese, you had Korean, you had Polish people, of course, Hungarian. After Second World War II, almost 500,000 Hungarians were sent in 1948 to Soviet Union in different kind of Gulag also, etc., etc. So it's interesting to notice that the concept of Gulag, which seems difficult sometimes to identify, is finally an international concept. It's an international concept because from the beginning you had people also who belonged to the communist movement. I met, for instance, twice in Paris, Jacques Rossi, who was a famous French sent to the Gulag, was a member of the Comintern in the 1920, and who was in Spain during the Civil War, and then he was sent to Moscow, where he never been, and he was arrested. He spent 20 years of his life in different Gulag as a foreign agent, despite the fact that he believed that he was a communist at the beginning. So you had this kind of people, but you had also simple, for instance, merchant. I found in archives a simple person who was a trader from Bombay in India, who wanted to make some trade with Russia, and he was sent also to the Solovki. And so many kinds of people. So this is this is the image from the movie here. I took some extract from the movie through the article 57, 58, spy, speculator, thieves. So from the beginning, the Solovki labor camp is not dedicated to political people. It's got his criminal appellation, denomination. You are thieves, you are that, and then you become a political criminal, etc., etc. So from the Lubyanka, you start your journey. Then you go by train to Cannes, and they explain with an animation movie kind of cartoons how you get from Kem, which is on the border, to the Solovki, which is here. So the whole journey is described from Moscow, Leningrad, Petrozavodsk, Kem, then by ferry to the Solovki Ostrov. So 1923, about 4,000 prisoners are sent there. At the end, in 1938, we had about 83,000 people who spent their part of their life in the Solovki, and half of them, almost 40,000, died for different reasons. Terror, of course, some were shot, and or also died of treatment. So this is also some scenes that I took from the movie. The movie is about 1.5 hours. And I find them interesting from an aesthetical perspective, because they remind a little bit Eisenstein or Ziga-Vertov so it means that the filmmaker was influenced by these movies that he saw. The Solovki is Sloan is contemporary to October by Eisenstein, the same year, 1927. But you have the same way how to film, or from Potemkin, you could see. Here in the Solovki, we are arriving. So in the whole movie, there is a narrative also explaining to the audience how it starts with the sabotage of the industry, then how you get arrested, and how you come there, and how you can be free. At the end, you can be free, and you can visit the beautiful archipelago. Also, real funny in the movie, you have one shot. We explain you how far you are from Venezia, for instance, in Italy. If you plan to make a trip to Italy, it's written, or to Warsaw, you have the distance which is written, etc. So Solovki remained a remote place, but at the time, it was also a terrible place, because in the imaginary of all the people who lived in Soviet Union at that time, they knew about the Solovki, and they knew that going to the Solovki is the end of your life, as also civil war devastated the economy, and you had this experience of militarized the political culture at that time. So the symbol of Solovki is very strong in the frame of all this authoritarianism, which started in the turn of the beginning of the 1920s. So the concept of the class enemy is important, because it's not only rhetoric and propaganda, it turned into a reality. So here are also some views from the films of different people who were sent. So there was a mixture between some criminals, which were arrested at that time, and some also women. There was a separate camp for women and for men, and women who belonged to the aristocrat of the bourgeois society in Petersburg or Moscow, who were sent them. So here, what I find from the small museum when I was there, took some pictures. It's a report about Solovki. The Solovki were reported by the GPU agent, and the famous leader of the OGPU was Friedrich Eichmann. That's also funny, because he got this name, which reminds another Eichmann, of course, who was in charge of the Theresienstadt movie, also, by the way. So Eichmann was an officer of the OGPU, and he was executed in 1938 during the Great Terror. So some of the manager of the different labor camp, because they didn't fulfill the commitment according to the Stalinist task, were killed were killed quite early. So you have at that time 90 the film is silent, so there is some text sometimes, but not always. So you have to try to understand. Here are some view of people coming by train, who were arrested, arriving to camp before they depart, and then arriving to the Solovki near the monastery, where they are displayed in different categories of camps. And you had at that time already 12,000, 13,000 prisoners and 1,500 guards. So the context of 1927, of course, is the context of the liquidation of all the political opposition, as I mentioned before, and forced collectivization of agriculture, class enemy, and this process was expanding later. So some scenes in the middle of the movie are about work and leisure. What is the work? So the work is quite simple. There are few mines. Mainly it's working in the forest, cutting woods, and some mines, and to build a kind of railroad which will go from one point to the other one. And this kind of, and in Russian it's written, the labor family. So the idea that you belong to a family and that you will be re-educated to a new life. That's also some scenes of the movie that, despite, of course, typhus, epidemics, infection, fear and terror, people should feel comfortable and are more or less happy. So you have a lot of scenes where you see them having this new family labor life, the camp as a collective family. And at that time, already, despite that you have peasant workers and former also GPU agents in the camp, you had also counter-revolutionaries, so white officer, social democrat, anarchist, then Trotskyist also, all the political inmates who get a special status in a way and were spread separately, and a colony of child also, because women came with their child. So we are not slave was the main lozung, and some picture of leisure life, that you can rest, you can play chess, you can enjoy yourself, and that's this scene also shocked the worker audience later, who saw what hell are they so do they have such a good life inside the camp. So there were a lot of schools, libraries, theaters. Even they were developing some theater which could be kind of avant-garde compared to the one which was forbidden at that time in Leningrad in 1928. So they had this kind, they could play soccer. So all this scene, and they had an orchestra. All these scenes were repeated in the Nazis movie. So that was the reason I was shocked, and I found that in parallel, and I decided how did it maybe affected the whole process of making film, and how did they maybe the German borrow from the Russian at that time to make a kind of movie repeating such a scene. So from all these pictures, there is this kind of representation of an utopian way of life as a kind of phalanstère, which was the French utopia of the 19th century already depicted. So this Soviet conception to re-educate through and thanks works fit quite strangely with what's later on Tarkovsky did in his movie when in Stalker he depicts what is the zona. The zona is this quite great gray place where you don't know what are your rights or your freedom, and that you can be also the next one to be sent to this kind of the gray zone. So at the end of the movie, you have a kind of delegation which came in the springtime, in May, June already, when it's possible to arrive by boat, by ferry, and they are able to bring some family to visit the inmates, as they said, but also to decide if they will release some of them were a good worker and would behave themselves for a better life. So it means that you can visit the camp, but you can also visit all the historical monuments that are there, and as if already you are in a touristical place, a kind of Disneyland, where inmates could visit their family. So it's interesting because here you see also what happened after the Solovki, the expansion of this dispositif, this device, when more than 1.5-8 million peasants were deported in 1930, 1931. Then go back. Yes, backward. Yeah, they were backward, yeah. Yes, thank you. Okay, keep going. Yeah, okay. Yeah, no. One more. No, forward, yeah. So the location of camp, the function of the Gulag, all these this subject were contained into already the movie of the Solovki, and were shaped by the new aspect of other Gulag, which appears later on in the 30s in the process of industrializing the Soviet Union. These are some statistics also of the planification of the Gulag and the impact of the Gulag. Here is a map of what were more and less the Gulag from 1930-32 after this movie, So the Solovki are here, and we have the White Baltic Canal, which was a big mad project set up by Stalin, where a lot of prisoners from the Solovki were sent there to build the Belomont Canal, where Gorky also used to come. And Gorky, by the way, came to the Solovki. He was sent from Italy just to praise and to quote it that there was a good life for all these people. And then the other canal was a big project from Moscow to the Volga, and the Zeus canal never worked. And then the expansion of different kind of labor camp already in the 1932 with different kind of function. according to the region, according to the work made by the inmates. So this system lasts for many decades, and I use so to say yes, among all these camps, which has only a kind of administrative appellation or bureaucratic, which we could say in France it's a kind of joke between lieu-dit and non-dit, which means that lieu-dit, a place which is named, but where is this place? And the non-dit, a place which cannot be called named, a non-dit, because it belonged to the anonymous history of those who were deprived of history. So this is a question of also which interests me in this research, which I try to develop, the idea of the history from not from above, but from below, from those people, a kind of anonymous history. How can we reconstruct it later on? What are the contrasts to write this kind of history? If the Gulag became finally kind of restricted designation, the first documentation we had were the first novels by Shalamov first, novel about Kolima, which was written in the mid-50s, and the Archipelago Gulag that Solzhenitsyn published in 1973 in France first, in Russian, and which became a huge success, as you know. And few films at that time, the Solovki by Solovyanskaya, by Marina Goldovskaya, and another movie that I want to mention, which was made by Hélène Châtelain, who is a French filmmaker, and she was also a translator of Russian literature because she was born in Ukraine. She died of the COVID 2 years ago, but she was able in 2000. She went in the mid-90s when it was more or less free at that time, at the end of the Yeltsin time, and she could make a few series about the Gulag, which were also the first series made at that time by a documentarist woman in the Solovki and in other places of the Gulag. Then there are other movies. I worked also with Nicolas Vert, the French historian of the Gulag, and we went 3 years ago, just before the pandemic, we could go to Finland and to Russia, where we showed a movie that Nicolas was working on, and we came out on the German-French channel called Gulag, a Soviet History, which is in a 3-part, and which was shown with great success in France, but we could show it in a liberal institution at the Museum Archlatova, thanks to the support of Memorial in Leningrad. And today, of course, we won't be able to do anything. And at that time, it was also difficult because we were not sure to get our visa because already we were. So here is a return of the Stalinism since. So there have been a lot of things written on that, but it's interesting to see the return of the image of Stalin, which is promoted not as a leader of the Gulag, but as the leader of the World War II. And I won't comment more because that is. And Memorial, so which was founded, by the way, by Arsène Roginsky in 1987. The way I remember, I defended him, wrote article in 1982 because Arsène Roginsky was an historian. He wrote few books, and he was banned in 1980s because he was working illegally in the archive. So he was sent to 3 years camp at that time in the north part of Karelia. And we were few scholars to defend him at that time, which was not also easy to do that. And then he found with Sakharov the NGO memorial, which was banned last winter by Vladimir Vladimirovich. So historical policy or historical memory is also an interesting question when you go back to film, and we try to deal with the Gulag as if historical memory was a factor of a Russian national consensus shaping a collective ideology in this Soviet tradition, as I tried to explain. But what could be the place and the function of the Gulag in that case to perpetuate the memory of the Gulag, which is significant for some particular group as memorial, but for most of them who were deprived to their rights in this emotional context. So memory became today also a struggle in Russia to reduce the process of history. And that also is very painful, not because only symbolically memorial had been banned and the Sakharov Center had been closed a few days ago. But it's also interesting because at the beginning, when Memorial started works, there were a lack of professional historians in Soviet Union because they were not trained, they had not access to information. So mainly those historians who worked on the Gulag and who came were foreigners, came from Japan, as I met some of them, they came from France, from US, from England, and they were trying to document all these aspects of the system. So the question all the time is this contradiction between history and memory. They have not the same status, And despite the fact that Memorial did a great job during 25 years, trying to go back to biographical aspect of the Gulag, trying to keep a memory, trying to make some few museums, and they did this small one in the Solovki. And even if there is one other official museum in Moscow, which is run by the city of Moscow, and which collaborates sometimes also with Memorial, even if they have not the same. So the question is how today these processes of history become unbearable, and there is some cut through generation, which are not at all aware about their own history compared to what had been done in Germany after World War II, where people were not only trained, but they were, sometimes I compare, there were more than 600 movie series, bad and good, on Nazi camp and on the camp in Germany, made in the US or in France or in Europe. But if we go back to Soviet Union, where you had more than 26 million of people who went through the Gulag, there is maybe less than 15 movies made by Russian or series about these topics. So it's quite also amazing to see that memory are refracted in fragmentation vision. The French historian Pierre Nora said history is the enemy of memories, from this perspective. So in 1927, Sloan, this film that I tried to explain, was an instrument of a politics which finally was very local and had a short impact, even if we rediscover it later on. And we are aware about what was the history of the Gulag since Sloan was released. But as it had to get a powerful effect. The function today of history in post-Soviet society seems very different, as the present ought to be more important than the past. And that is, of course, interesting when you see how Putin refers to some kind of history about his invasion of Ukraine. He tried to connect it to some history which had been erased, and that most of the people are not aware of in Russian society or post-Soviet society today. So history is today used as a national purpose in a nationalistic or chauvinist perspective. And the reading of the Gulag, I think, will be much more confused for the next generation. But coming back to what wrote Pierre Nora in the 70s in his book Les lieux de mémoire, so-called memories, this interaction between cinema and history is interesting because I tried to understand what were the zone, which modes do interfere in this movie between the context that I tried to explain and between what the film tried to show. So there are here this idea that we could also consider this film as a narrative because it exposes with a kind of dramatization and from the beginning you are arrested and then you can be released. There is a whole kind of narrative in a kind of romantic, I put it in like the whole story of the Gulag. And this is also another aspect which is interesting where you explore this kind of movie because both Theresienstadt, the film given, the city given to the Jews by the Führer, and Sloan are similar in the way that you see how inmates are able on the screen to internalize their prison. The prison is it internalized? A good word in English? Yes, to internalize the concept of prison themselves and to show it to the viewer on the screen because they knew that they were shot, and some are smiling. In the German movie, you see there is more fear because people knew at that time that the next step will be Auschwitz and the extermination. But people are not acting or staging; they are not actors. And there are, in the history of cinema, where you had thousands of movies done, I think these are the two examples of totalitarianism regime, of people who were shot and who were killed just after the shooting. No one remained, maybe few from the Solovki, but no one remained from the German movie because 1 month after the film was released, everybody was sent to Auschwitz, and even the film director, who was a famous actor called Geron, died there. So you also are able to relate what is between film and what is between not film, what is extra filmic, what is said and what is unsaid. If this reality appear to be fake, it's not totally fake because there are some part of truth in the way that the reality is conveyed directly by these images of this movie. So a propaganda movie is interesting to study because this propaganda movie is very different from what we know also from the Soviet propaganda movie of that time, or German propaganda movie by Leni Riefenstahl or other filmmaker, because it shows a gap between what exists and the historical reality. So I would maybe conclude because I don't know we have much time, and maybe there are some questions if I can answer. I will conclude quoting Walter Benjamin. That my cousin Svetlana used to quote also in her book, The Future of Nostalgia, that the goal remained finally ethical. Walter Benjamin said, the continuity, this German philosopher, Jewish German philosopher who was also killed at the Spanish border in 1940, trying to escape from the German, and who spent few times in Moscow at the beginning. He was not Marxist, but he was close to some Marxist ideas. So he went to Moscow in the late 20s, and he came to France and he settled in France. He had a terrible life in Paris. But he used to say, I quote him, the continuity of history belongs to the oppressor. history of the oppressed people is a discontinuity. And I think in that case, that the history of those who were deprived of history is interesting. I did other work lately after that on Armenian genocide in film, trying to also understand what kind of film had been done by Turkish. The lack of visual traces, because we have visual traces of Armenian deportation, mainly photography. The same also with the German camp. We have some some photography which was used by the Nazi officer when the last Hungarian deportation arrived in Auschwitz on June 6, 1944. So then Cambodia also is an interesting case. I was there also, and I tried to find also some interesting documentary about how the Red Khmer use images in their processes of genocide. So film, in a way, become a source of history, kind of a source and also an agent. Quoting the French historian Marc Ferraud, was my supervisor, as source, as an agent of history. What is finally compared to the banality of the evil? Who is the invisible enemy? What does it mean to film the enemy? If we go back to this movie, which finally circulated a little bit in Europe, a little bit more in Soviet Union at that time, and which constitute, I think, a valuable document for the studies of loss and memories. That was my point of view when I started this research, and I wanted to share it with you. Thank you very much for listening to me. And if there is any question, I would be pleased to answer to them. Thank you. Want to show some picture of the movie, we can also.
Thank you. I think we should try to open it up for questions also, because we have a good many people who've been listening to you, which is very exciting. And maybe they also have questions, and maybe people here have questions. So,
2 slides that I didn't show. The last one is what is the fate of the Gulag today? Thanks internet, we have a Gulag online. With the work of Memorial, and I quoted also Khodorovsky after his stay in a camp in Karelia, also in Russia, when he was released. And that's also interesting to see. Okay.
Yes, we have a question.
Hello, I'm Margarita. I work here as a postdoc. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very impressive, and I didn't know about the movie before. I have 2 short questions, if I may. So the first one is kind of methodological, because I am myself an art sociologist, and when I see one, it's always a pleasure, because it's not necessarily too often. I would ask you to explain your approach in this regard more. Like, would you say it's film history or film sociology, or is it like a difference between like social history of film and what you do? That's the first one. The second one is, the whole story with the film is so mysterious, because, like as you said, we don't know much about the director and the producer. And I was thinking, like, ethically, like, how would this person feel doing this movie? And I was thinking about Rodchenko and his theory about the Belomor Canal. And I know it wasn't easy, but possibly we can't say much, right? Because we don't know. And that's why also I appreciate your approach so much, because it's like Soviet mediocre propaganda. But in this regard, if you can't give us, because there is no data, like more the social context of the production, I would like, can you speculate on that? Like, why did they need this movie? to advertise the camp, because it's not a product, and people who went there, they didn't choose to be there. Like what could be the purpose for Soviet citizens?
Thank you. Concerning the first question of my approach, mainly I'm trained as a sociologist, so I do work with oral interview, with archives, social archive. I work also with historians, so that was difficult when I got the movie at the beginning, even if it was important for me to have been to the Solovki and to have seen more or less how the location looked like. It was important then to try to find out more evidence. So about the filmmaker, unfortunately, I was not lucky, and I explored a lot of archives. I think I've been in all the archives places in Berlin, but the research is never done, And then I went also to Moscow, so where I was more lucky about the Soviet film, because I found some newspaper who quoted this movie, and especially at the Geek library. I was there for a conference, and then I decided to go and see what's in the Geek, and this is amazing because the Geek, maybe you've been there. Moscow is a film school. One building is totally new; it's a kind of new Russia, and the other one is Soviet Union, and both are together. So as usual, I asked some of my colleagues, and they told me, "Oh, there is a kind of library." So I went to the library. There was books and nothing, but they said, "Oh no, there is. We have some archives. You should go further down in the basement." So I went down in the basement, and there was funny. There was a woman smoking a cigarette and drinking tea, and she was so happy to see me because she said, "Nobody come to visit me." So I will try to help you. I said, "I'm working on this movie, Sloan. Could you find maybe some newspaper article?" And she found a file. So I explored all the file, that was but it was also a kind of chance. The second question is,
why did they make the movie?
Why did they make? I try to give some answer because I quoted. I found that was mainly in France. I found some other archives about some newspaper at that time, that the labor camp was from this Latvian newspaper advertising that there is a labor camp, and Soviet authority was frightened that they could not get some funding from the West in their trade, because Scandinavian, Baltic were already complaining that they were camp and we should not trade with Soviet Union. So for this reason, I think they decided to make the movie. But then I was not able to go often to Moscow, and maybe if I go to maybe other places, at the regularly it was difficult to get access to archive. Maybe there is some archive where you have an order which is clear about why you should do this movie, for which reason, etc. And I found in some memoir also that was interesting, the way of how they shoot the movie also in the summer somewhere. So there were some people describing the shooting of the movie at that time when the team came, but the team was very small. There was one cameraman, one assistant, and that's it. So of course the movie was made under control at the end, the process of editing, and so you can imagine, especially in 1927, 1928. Yes.
Thank you for this fantastic talk, and I guess I'll continue with some sociological questions. So you mentioned that even in the Soviet Union, the film's circulation was limited. Could you talk more about that? Why do you think it was not shown more broadly?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I found in some material, yes, that the film was rarely screened, yeah, because maybe in the turn when the film came out in the turn of the 30s, situation had changed also, and the idea was not to advertise too much about the industrial process of labor camp, because Solovki, from its start in 1923 until this movie 1928, was a little bit chaotic. You know, they didn't know how it will work totally. But when Stalin took the power in 1928, he decided to expand the industrial process and to start the first plan to industrial the North area. So we should not advertise about the fact that we are using all these labor forces and we will not make movies. It was totally counterproductive, according. Or there were some picture of Belomar Canal, yes, which was circulating, but not a movie claiming that we are deporting people. Even if then there was later on I don't remember, I got it at home. In 1935, there was another movie made on Siberia by about labor camp. Very few. Yeah.
So there are short movies about the Belomar Canal.
Yes, there are, and they are even displayed at the Gulag Museum in Moscow. You show, if you have been there in Moscow, there are few sets where you can TV set where they show mainly not only on the Belomar Canal and on industrialization, but also on trial. A lot of movies were done, not a lot, but few movies were done and material on trials. Yeah.
I was wondering, at some point you talked about the aesthetics of the movie, and you mentioned that they reminded you of both Vertov and Eisenstein, which is striking, right? Because I don't think either of them would have appreciated being put in the same comparison. But
they hate each other.
Exactly. But the operator for this movie was Alexander Lembin, who also worked with Vertov on Kinon and Delia. And I think I can see very much the Vertov.
The first Vertov, the chronology, yeah.
The Kino Pravda and the Kinon and Delia afterwards, yeah. So I can very much see that, association. I was more curious about what you found reminded you of Eisenstein in the movie.
Oh, because I was thinking because of October 1927, which was a film which was also how you say zakaz in English? Come on,
Ordered. Yeah.
Or an order, yes, we said an order, and which failed in his goal because then the Russian authority didn't expect also such a movie, and the movie were more and less also forbidden in 1927 because Eisenstein in his narrative didn't show concretely that the party was at the end of the revolution. He wanted to show that there was a kind of freedom among the Soviets at that time in October. So this movie also failed in its goal in a way, and maybe there are a few scenes which could remind the way how to shoot in this Soviet time using montage and using this kind of aesthetic, but rather soon also Eisenstein was forbidden for Beijing his movie about Beijing, which didn't. And then went to US to start a kind of new career, and then came back. I would not compare totally with Eisenstein. It's a nonsense. But there are some things which make me think that the Cherkasov was influenced by what he's seen at the time, and maybe unconsciously wanted to compete with these kind of movies. Yes.
So if we're talking about filmic analogies, one that comes to my mind is the film Road to Life by Nikolai Ek, which was the Soviet sound film, which, of course, it's a fiction film that tells about a similar colony for children that was meant to re-educate them.
Re-educate, yes.
And it seems to go well with the point.
But it was a fiction movie.
Yeah. But I wonder if Nikolai Ek was actually familiar with this film. But also, you have mentioned earlier that Stalin's government was not as interested by that time in re-educating, but it was more interested in labor. So perhaps the idea of re-education now belongs to the world of childhood, but for adults, it's labor. I don't know if that interpretation makes sense. And also, if you've heard of, in the process of your research, if you've heard, or if you've seen any evidence that Nikolai Ek liked the film, or perhaps
that I could not answer. Yeah, I don't know about that. Did Nikolai Ek wrote about that?
I have not seen that, but it seems that there is a resonance between these two. One was not especially
because Nikolai Ek, as far as I remember this film that I saw a long time ago, the big task was to at that time for the regime to fight against orphanage. You have 100,000 of children who were on the road without parents, and they were by themselves. Some were also criminal in a way. When the Solovki started, it was also because at the camp in 1920, because of the civil war, the Red Terror, and that the prison were already packed. They needed to find new location to put these people who are criminalized. So the film by Nikolai Ek want to show that there is a kind of hope at the end, and the child is able to make his life, despite the whole context was tragic all around. So there have been a few works about that from not about film, but I have a colleague in Italy who wrote a book on this question of orphanage in the 1930s. I can give you the reference. Maybe I can also ask her, because of your question when I come back, what does she think about about that.
I don't see any questions in the chat. I don't know if people can also raise their hands if they prefer, but it's usually easier with the chat function, right, Sasha?
Either is fine. I can see them both.
You can see them both. Yeah.
So it doesn't look like we have anything at this point.
Okay. So I think maybe Kristian, if you also want to share your email if people have questions afterwards. Sometimes it takes a while to process and
I will answer that.
Yeah. And yes.
How can we watch the movie? Is it online?
Yes, I found once a link on YouTube.
Yeah.
And I sent it to the Jordan Center.
It's online.
I even wrote an article that I never published because I was lazy to I published in France, I published one in Brazil, but I have an article in English, so if you know any journal who might be interested, I can send the article for pleasure to share my ideas about this movie. The article is already written, so it's not a big deal to send it to some journal.
Thank you so much, Kristian.
Thank you that you attended.